The radical fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brooks Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brooks Show on this Monday evening. I'm super happy to have Bryan Caplan here with me. Bryan, I think most of you know, is an economist, a professor of economics at George Mason University, and is the author of a bunch of books. We're going to be talking about, I don't know, I keep looking at the titles and thinking, okay, I should ask you something about this too. So we'll talk about Build, Baby, Build. We'll talk about immigration. We'll talk about, I'm thinking, I want to ask you about selfish reasons to have kids and more. We'll see.
All right, let's do it.
Welcome, Bryan. Thanks for joining me.
Fantastic to be here.
I'm glad. And you guys watching live, you can ask questions. And Super Chat is open. I think it's running. Everything's running. Everything's good. We're good. We're good to go. So latest book is Build, Baby, Build. It's a second in a series of kind of animated books. Is that right?
So usually say nonfiction graphic novel, but a graphic book.
Nonfiction graphic novel. Okay, that's a mouthful. Animated books is good. Tell me a little bit about why the nonfiction graphic novel, why that format, what attracted it to you, what attracted it to you, and how's it been so far in terms of feedback?
Yeah, well, so I'm an academic, and academics write a lot of dry, boring, but important and amazing work. And it's all of those things. And then the problem is, well, how do you get people to actually learn about these amazing discoveries? In this particular case, for about 20 years, economists have been measuring how much harm housing regulation does to the economy. And they're coming up with really high estimates, something like the government has managed to double the price of housing compared to what it would be in a free market, which then leads to a lot of other problems that, as usual, get blamed on the free market. This is something that is remarkable because it's so nonpartisan. Today, I was just talking with Jason Furman, who was head of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and he's completely on board with this stuff too. Paul Krugman's on board with this stuff. It's not just one particular kind of economist. There's a wide range of economists who have enough common sense, enough basic understanding of markets to say, whatever you think about government generally, this time government has royally screwed up.
So I mean, that is true in so many cases. I mean, there's still rent control in America, right? I mean, when was the last paper on rent control? So the graphic novel is a way to get to more people, right?
So it's that. I mean, there's a few things going on. So one is to engage the audience more, to make it more exciting. Another thing is to use this power of combining words and pictures to communicate more information in a short amount of time. It really does work. It's a standard idea that if you have the right images, the idea will be communicated more effectively. As someone who actually teaches college students, I'm always aware of how little attention they're paying and how boring they find it. So even when you get their full attention, a lot of ideas that seem obvious to experts are really hard for most people to get. And that's why I said, look, give me any tool I can get to go and communicate this knowledge to another person. It's just so hard to teach someone else. Just give me everything and I'll see if I can do better than I've been doing before.
And how have you found it? What has been the response?
Well, I'll say that I think that I'm getting way more people to read this book than almost anything else I could have ever written on housing regulation. I have billed it as the most fascinating book ever written on housing regulation, and I feel like I'm on firm ground there. No offense to my competition. They're noble people, but I think that this is a lot more entertaining. In particular, like what I'm going for is I always want to write something where people who are specialists in the area will read it and say, this is accurate and insightful. At the same time, it can be read by a lot of other people as well. With my university press books, basically I'm saying, all right, anyone from a actual research specialist down to a motivated undergraduate can read it. But for the graphic novels there, I know I've gotten down to precocious elementary school kids
Oh,
I
well.
don't understand everything, but
Yeah.
like right at this chair, when I was doing my first graphic novel, my 5-year-old daughter was reading over my shoulder. And I'm like, yeah, she never read anything else I wrote over my shoulder. I think I've got something here.
Absolutely. So let's get into the meat of it. Both of us are going to have, we start off with the assumption the regulations are bad. But here we have a situation where clearly housing costs have been going up and up and up, particularly since the financial crisis. And I'm curious
Yes, it goes back way further than that, actually. It
I'm
goes
curious
back
about
40
what you think
years.
about before that. So when
Yeah.
does this start? When does this trend
Yeah.
upwards, above what you'd expect normally? Although, would you agree that in a kind of free market, you'd expect housing prices to decline, not to go up?
Well, what I expect is that in a free market, price is going to equal average cost in the long run. That's the idea. If price is above average cost, that's basically a big flashing sign above the industry. Enter, do the job at basic competence, and you will make extra money. So that's the way that markets normally work. Anytime price is above average cost, that provokes entry. So I would say that it's sometime around between 1970 and 1980, where if you just look at the historical numbers, that's when things seem to first go haywire. We actually do have numbers going back for the US for about a century. And what you'll see for the before 1970 to 1980 is that sometimes housing prices would go up quite a bit and they go back down. And they go up and then they go back down, right? Which is the way that markets normally work, because if there is a demand shock, then sure, prices go up. But then if this means there is a disparity between price and average cost, you get entry, and then prices get driven back down to average cost until the next thing comes along. In terms of would you expect that prices would keep coming down in the long run? Let's see. So, I mean, some of that, of course, let me put it this way. So, all of these prices that I'm talking about are all adjusted for inflation.
Sure.
So once you're adjusting for inflation, then it's like, well, we've already accounted for average changes in prices. So in that case, it doesn't really make sense to say that you expect that prices will always be adjusting for inflation. It does make sense, however, as you may know from reading people like Cox and Om or Julian Simon, that the price of goods in terms of an hour of labor, that can always be going down, and that is the normal thing in a progressive economy.
And it strikes me that housing is ultimately a consumption good.
Well, so yeah, that's the main thing. I mean, definitely you can say that in a free market, we wouldn't have the same rigid barrier between residences and businesses. Even now in a country like Japan, there's a basic national right to operate a small store in your home, and local government isn't allowed to do anything about it. And yes, in a really free market where you can do whatever you want with your own property, then it would, like, you would say, well, home is like 80% residence or 80% consumption, 20% investment.
Yep.
Even now in the US tax code, we have these provisions for business use of a home, but woe betide you if you put a sign on your door and say, hey, $30 to join us for dinner tonight. But in a real free market, all kinds of that stuff could be happening. But yeah, basically you'd figure that in a developed economy, not too many people are going to have a stranger pop in for dinner. But then again, like, that's part of the beauty of the market, is you don't really know. Like Airbnb, who thought that someone would want to rent out a room for $50? Exactly. It turns out a lot of people want to do that.
So what happens around 1970 to change things?
Yeah, so this is one where honestly, a lot of the way that researchers measure things is they focus on, well, when do we start seeing this permanent and large and growing disparity between price and average cost? And then honestly, what researchers usually do is they just define the cost of regulation as that gap. Essentially just saying, look, there's just so many different regulations all piled on top of each other. It's really hard to disentangle what one regulation is doing versus another. So let's just get what economists call reduced form, where we just get the sum of all the total hit. If you are really picky, you say, well, there's some issues. Yeah, there are some issues. It's the real world, so no research is going to be perfect. But I think the reasonable story is that is the time when a lot of regulations that have been on the books start getting enforced more and more strictly. There's often, it's very common actually for there to be a regulation that's on the books. It doesn't do much harm for a while because not that many people know about the law. There isn't a professional industry of parasites that just try to go and take advantage of the law. So it seems like in the 70s and 80s, 1970, 1980 is when things start to get very serious. I mean, if you were to go and point like what happened, So like some of it is just that, like when you're talking about cities, that before this period, yes, you've got to go and get local government approval to build a skyscraper, but local governments aren't that bad at the time.
Mhm.
And they're just like, okay, fine, you can build a skyscraper if you do the following things, which add 10 or 20% of the cost, but delay you for a couple of years, but it's still reasonable. But then it is in this later period that you start getting things like San Francisco just saying no skyscrapers for like 15 years straight, zero, right? Which doesn't mean that the law says they can't be built. It just means that the law is enforced so strictly and so unfairly. And it's the combination. It's, some people say death by 1,000 cuts. Probably 1,000 is too many, but it's very common if you want to do anything cool that you have to go through 3 boards of regulatory approval, each one making its own demands on you, each one with separate complaints. And then in each of these, there's likely to be some public hearings where a small number of people who claim to represent all of society, but actually just represent themselves, go and cause trouble.
Were there any nationwide regulations, or are these almost all local, state?
Yeah, good question. Right. So there's environmental regulations which are nationwide. So environmental review, which again is mostly going to matter if you're doing a larger project, but so that affects the entire country. Something else that doesn't get much attention, but I suspect it is a big deal. In the 60s, the federal government started twisting the arm of state and local governments, saying, if you want to get our federal grants, you need to have special meetings with community input. And again, community input, of course, does not mean the actual community shows up. The community never shows up for a meeting. It's a few people who have an axe to grind, and then they go and manage to sort of some of them are professionalized, and you can actually do this as a living of just disrupting other people's business, or you do it as your hobby, but it could be a big hobby if you're retired or whatever. So actually in the book, I'm a bit embarrassed that there is one huge thing the federal government does that I knew about, but it just slipped my mind. So I'm posting a piece on the Volokh Conspiracy blog this week, just saying, "Oh, gee, like how could I have forgotten this?" But it's if you've ever seen the map of the share of every state owned by the federal government and by state governments, so it is an absurdly high share for the whole country. And for a number of states, you're getting into about 90% of all the land in the state is owned by the government.
I think it's 75% of all the land west of the Mississippi.
Yeah, that sounds correct. I'm not sure if that's counting Alaska, because Alaska is like 90% when you do federal and state. But yeah, so like basically the piece that I write here, like take a look at that map and it's real time and you say, well, it's just the government owns the land no one in the right mind would want, so it just doesn't make any difference. But then here's 2 things. First of all, if you know the history, almost everything that actually became available for settlement prior to the rise of the conservation movement end up being privately owned. Especially at the federal level. With states, it's a little different because there are notable shares of New York and Florida actually that are owned by the state governments, the level of maybe 20%. But first of all, there's this historical pattern. We say, it seems like during the period when the philosophy was much more sympathetic to private property, almost everything ended up in private hands. And then John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt and those guys came along and then ruined an otherwise fine system. But here I would say is the really strong argument that it's not just that government owns the land nobody else would want, which is if you take a look at Texas, there's almost no land owned by the government, not barely any owned by state or federal.
Yeah.
And yet, if you have driven in West Texas, it is the greatest wasteland you'll ever go through.
Absolutely.
And it's like, honestly, like who would want to own this land? And it's like, well, there's oil drilling, first of all. There's a bit of farming. And finally, there's just private owners who's like, well, population's growing. Eventually, it'll be something. I'll just hold on to it. And of course, they are paying property taxes on that land, so it's not free, but they consider it to actually have some speculative value. And I think it's very reasonable to say that if you privatize the rest of the country, it would go for something greater than zero anyway.
And if you look at, I don't know, Phoenix and Las Vegas, they're not exactly built on prime real estate. They're built on,
of course. Right. I mean, actually, here's something that might interest your listeners. Once you realize how much land is owned by government, when you imagine privatization, it's really easy to imagine someone really rich building a charter city in a place that's currently unoccupied. And the very fact that no one is there at all means that you are really free to do wild things with that land. And you can say, all right, this is going to be a place where like it's going to be the Wild West and you can build anything you want. Or I'm going to go and put a bunch of skyscrapers here. This will be the Dubai of Arizona. And since there's nobody else around, there's no one to complain. And I can do a pile of stuff before anyone even notices what I'm doing.
Yep. So you're arguing that basically regulations, but primarily on the local level, have restricted increased building. Is this true across the country? Are there areas in the country where we don't see this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say that there is little sign that regulation matters in places nobody lives. All right. Other than the government won't sell the land.
Yep.
But this is actually one of the more interesting results in the history of the research. So there's early papers by Glazer and Jerko where they basically come and say, all right, well, regulation is really bad in major cities, especially so like San Francisco, New York, a few places like that. But even the early paper said, but otherwise, the rest of the country, things are pretty close to class. It's no big deal. But then later on, better data arrives. And with better data, they're able to go and say more about at a finer level of detail. And basically then they're able to say, all right, how bad is the burden of regulation right in the center city and right in center cities when you're 5 miles out, 10 miles, 20, 30. And this is a paper by Jerko and Krimmel where, by the way, they'll disagree with my interpretation of the paper, but I think that their numbers are on my side. I mean, they really come away saying that anywhere where a lot of people want to live, regulation's bad. There's really almost no place where people desire to live in large numbers where you can totally do whatever you want. Now, that said, there's immense variation, and there are places that are notoriously strangled, like San Francisco. And then also, on the other hand, there's Texas, where it's really pretty good. And yes, if you talk to people in Texas, they'll argue with you and say, no, it's terrible in Texas.
Yep.
You see what's going on here. And it's like, do you know what the rest of the country's like? So, I spent a lot of time in Austin during COVID. In Austin, I've heard people say, oh, like housing prices are out of control. It's like, first of all, not bad at all compared to a lot of the country.
Absolutely.
But anyway, here's the cool thing is that you can drive 40 minutes south of Austin right in between Austin and San Antonio. And then you're down to 4-bedroom houses for $300,000.
Yep.
That was 4 years ago. So that's probably changed a little bit. But that gives you, so that gives you an idea about how it works. And particularly what's cool about the Jerko and Krimmel paper is that you've got some places like LA where the strict zoning just extends onto the horizon. Really, you have to get like 50 miles from downtown LA before the zoning stops to be a big deal. And here, by the way, zoning here is just like all regulation, really. Researchers refer to the zoning tax, which is confusing to lawyers because in legal terms, zoning is only one corner of the regulation. So it's a catch-all for all of the extra costs that regulation is causing. But places like LA, the regulation just extends for a very large area. On the other hand, in Chicago, for example, the estimates say that the regulatory burden is terrible right in the downtown, but 30 miles away, then it's not so bad.
Okay.
So there's a lot of details going on. I mean, essentially, the story is that the worst areas are so egregious that once you study those, it becomes hard to notice mere ordinary bad policy.
Yeah.
So if you look at San Francisco, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Austin seems to be prices seem to have come down in the last year or so, maybe as part of a more natural cycle.
Mm-hmm. Right. Also, probably partly a lot of San Franciscans and Californians returning to California.
Going back.
Temporary boost in demand. And then, but they just wanted to get away from the COVID policy.
So what do you do about the claim, arguments? San Francisco is a beautiful city, maybe one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And you start putting a bunch of skyscrapers on these beautiful rolling hills, and it just destroys the beauty of the city and it blocks people's view. And that just seems wrong.
Yeah. So a lot of the reason why I decided to do this particular topic as a graphic novel was that I realized a lot of the complaints about a free housing market are just aesthetic. It's just, I don't like the way that it looks. My thinking was by actually drawing alternate visions of what cities could look like and what developments could look like, I could fight aesthetics with aesthetics. I've got a chapter called Bastiat's Buildings. I'm sure you know about Bastiat.
Yep.
Famous 19th century French economist. Probably his famous and his best essay is just called, On What Is Seen and What Is Not Seen. He said a lot of the reason why people like government is they focus on the visible thing that government accomplishes and they ignore all the collateral damage. Right. So this is what I thought was a particularly strong case for housing, where people go and they look at a city the way that it is, and it isn't that gorgeous. And like, well, but what about what it would be? It could be something different. Maybe it actually would be a lot better. Right. It's pretty hard to convince people of this just argumentatively. Although, I think there are some pretty good points of things like the Eiffel Tower is really unpopular at first. It's just a historical fact. It is totally normal for things that people consider iconic and inviolable were initially considered to be horrible eyesores. So like there is that too, but just to try to get people to envision what would they do. And like the question, like, well, why do you assume that people want to build ugly stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you so convinced that that's the first thing that would happen? So in the book, I've got some images that I'm really proud of. For example, California is famous for its undeveloped coastline. And yet, if you've traveled around the world, you might have noticed the best coastlines are not the undeveloped ones. The best coastlines are the ones where they combine an amazing human habitations with the nature. So I don't know, have you ever been to the Amalfi Coast, Yaron?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so you go there and it's like,
One of
now
those
this
beautiful
is
places,
awesome. This
yeah.
is way better than just uninhabited coastline. Here you've got this wonderful blending of human ingenuity and building in this quite challenging environment with the natural beauty. So I think that is, at least a good part of the argument, is just saying, look, you are assuming it's going to be bad. Like, why? What actual argument do you have? And even when you're tearing down a beautiful building, like maybe they're going to build a better building. You don't really know that. At least consider the possibility. I mean, I think actually a lot of this, to my mind, it's an extension of Alex Epstein's idea of the anti-impact standard,
Yep.
which for him, it's just unimpact. You can't impact nature. But there's also an idea of you can't even impact an earlier thing made by humans. Like anything that exists, so you've got to just keep it the way that it is.
Yeah.
Right.
How
I mean,
much
like
do
in
you
particular,
think-
then when you're getting really into historical development, this is something where I'd also just say, all right, a lot of this is just cheap talk and people claiming that they really care about things, and yet their actual behavior shows that they don't. It's one thing to say, I want to save this one particular beautiful building or whatever, to say, like, I just can't bear the thought of San Francisco losing half of its 2- and 3-story homes. Is like, yeah, I think you can get over it real quick, actually. You don't actually like those. Like, we save some, and when the free market will do it anyway, but to save all of them, it's crazy.
Yeah, and if you want to save some, it's relatively easy to buy them.
Yes.
Just get a fund together and get a bunch of people to buy them. It's if it's this such a value for so many people, shouldn't be hard at all to do.
Yeah, I mean, step one with an historical home is a lot of people actually like the idea of living in a historical home.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to me, these people always seem a bit crazy because it's like, it's so inconvenient, but it's like, all right, fine. You want to spend your own money that way? Fine. Go and live in a 100-year-old house where it's breaking down all the time. But first of all, there's that basic private demand to go and just actually occupy an historic home. And then there is commercial uses, so tourism, that kind of thing. And then finally, there is the philanthropic, where you go and raise money to go and preserve something.
Mhm.
I'll say, look, those three things, it's not going to preserve everything. It is plenty. And then, finally, like a point that I push pretty hard is just the slippery slope. When you go and read early advocates of regulation, they sound pretty reasonable. It's like, look, there's this problem. It's this one really nice building. Why can't we just bend the principle just a little bit? Why do you have to be so stubborn? And it's like, well, because it ended up where we are now, where we literally have historic parking garages. That's why the free market approach was the right approach all along. And if we just listened to people saying this stuff is going to get out of control, we would have avoided all this nonsense.
Slippery slopes exist everywhere. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the idea of slippery slope is not an issue in the real world. I mean, I run
God, where do
across
they
you,
live?
like, what are you, crazy?
Where
Of
do
course.
they live?
Yes.
An example of a city where with beautiful hills and a beautiful view, and where they don't have a problem with skyscrapers, is Hong Kong,
Oh, yeah.
which is a gorgeous place.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I haven't been there, but yeah, definitely seen the pictures.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And it reminds you of San Francisco, but with skyscrapers.
Mhm.
And it's stunning.
Yep. I mean, so I think people that don't live in the Bay Area, they don't realize how undeveloped the peninsula is.
Yeah.
But in my book, I've actually got drawings of helicopter shots where you see the skyscrapers are maybe 10% of the area of the main part of the peninsula, and then most of it is just 2 and 3 story buildings, which obviously developers would love to go and buy up for 10 times what they cost, knock them down, and put skyscrapers.
Absolutely. Well, to what extent do you, given we're talking about San Francisco, to what extent do you attribute the homeless problem in places like San Francisco to housing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So initially, I was skeptical of this idea that it mattered very much, but I learned 2 things. So one is there are multiple definitions of homelessness. So there's actual street homelessness, which was normal people talk about, but actual statistics, which give you much higher numbers. Normally, that's more like couch surfing or just sleeping on your brother's couch. So anyway, that's first fact to understand is that the definitions actually vary quite a bit, and you need to pay attention to what definition people are actually using. But anyway, there is this book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, and it does show, I think, pretty convincingly that the absolute value of rent, just the dollar value of rent for a cheap place, really is a very good predictor of homelessness. And it does, like, you put this together and it's like, all right, you have to be really dysfunctional to not be able to afford a cheap apartment in Mississippi. Whereas in the Bay Area, it's pretty different. And yeah, you've got to actually be pretty functional to be able to afford a cheap apartment there. I definitely think that there's a lot more to homelessness than just housing prices. There's irresponsible behavior. If someone will spend 100% of everything that they receive on drugs, then they're going to be homeless, whatever you do for them. But there's that. Now, there's also a point, which I think is reasonable, that in an unregulated world, you would be able to go and build what used to be called a flop house, dormitory style housing. Right now, normally that's basically limited to students, but there's no reason why you couldn't have that as well. So, I mean, I think that there's, these things all together, I think it is reasonable to think that this would go and mitigate the homelessness problem. It's like, I think that there's some over optimism of people just saying like that would just take care of it, right? Like there's just some very irresponsible people who will not go and spend money in a remotely prudent way. But still, it's a continuum, and there's people that are able that will go and reserve $500 to make rent, so they're on the streets, and otherwise will spend most of what they earn on drugs or alcohol. And then there's people who won't even do that, and that takes care of some of the problem.
It does seem like the more California spends on free housing, that is housing for the homeless, that they don't have to pay for, the more homeless people they get, which shocks these people.
Yeah, so this is one where I know there's a number of researchers saying, no, we can't see in the data, but yeah, I suspect it actually is true, and that there's something, I feel like there's something they're not telling me. I'm not an expert in this area, but yes, the idea that the homeless do migrate in response to incentives seems quite plausible. Yeah, and again, it's also one where it's like over what time frame? All right, so if you go and expand the number of beds, do 10,000 more homeless show up tomorrow? Probably not, but over the course of 5 years, then it seems plausible that they actually would. So yeah, it seems like this is actually, by the way, this is one of the many issues that I talk about in chapter 3 of the book, which I call the panacea policy. Like if all that the research said was that deregulation would make housing a lot cheaper, I would sort of feel like, all right, that's cool, but that's not really a book. But on the other hand, I realize there's just a lot of issues that seem unrelated to housing, and furthermore, issues that people feel like it's just intractable. Say, no, not only is it tractable, but there is a single policy that makes a big dent in all of them. I see right behind you, you've got equal is unfair.
Yep.
Right. It's also true that you can get even more unfairness by deliberately causing bad kinds of inequality. Right? So you've got, North Korea has tremendous inequality, and it's even more unfair than things being equal, because it's the worst guy in the country living as a billionaire.
Although I think the Gini coefficient is probably shows equality, right?
Yeah, well, so based
the number of people who are unequal,
based on their own official numbers, yes, but. I mean, I've even talked to people who were Sovietologists or historians, and I said, well, what if you actually counted the Soviet Union as being Stalin's personal property? Then what? It's like, yeah, well, then it would be the most unequal country on earth. All right, so how about we do it that way? What's wrong? And even they say, yeah, I guess that's another way you could
Yep.
do it. I don't see why not. And, all right,
Yep.
great. All right, so one pretty striking fact is that housing is what economists call necessity, which means that the richer you are, the smaller share of income you normally spend on it. Bill Gates spends less than 1% of his income on his housing for
Hmm.
obvious reasons. He can live in a palatial estate, multiple ones, and it barely
Multiple
makes a
ones,
dent
yeah.
in his income. All right, now this is relevant because um, this means that if you deregulate housing and housing falls, the housing price falls by a constant amount, but a larger share of the gains do go to the poor than to the rich because the poor are spending a larger share of their income on this stuff.
Hmm.
Anyway, which is striking because it's one of many nice examples of where economists especially just talk about government as facing the equity efficiency trade-off. They're always imagining people in government saying, well, God, we could have free markets work and produce abundance, but on the other hand, it would be so unfair. What do? We have this very tough decision to make. And housing regulations in the United States are like, no, it is a no-brainer. You can get better performance for markets, more equality just by having government do less. Do that. And maybe after that, people won't be feeling so bad about the level of inequality. A particularly cool paper that I wound up talking about in the book. So you probably know about Thomas Piketty's stuff on capital,
Gus.
right? And he's got this whole story about capital feeds on capital, and as long as the interest rate is above the rate of economic growth, capital naturally expands. A lot of problems with that argument, but there's a professor at Northwestern named Matt Ronley, who, when he's a grad student, actually got the numbers, and he
Hmm.
said, wait a second. If you go and look at these numbers that Piketty is using, showing a rising capital share in a bunch of different countries, it turns out that rising housing prices explains 100% of the change. All that's going, like, there is no actual tendency of capital to feed on capital. It's not that people are passing on inheritances which keep growing. All that's
Yep.
happening is government is strangling a vital sector, and people who are lucky and bought when prices were low get this big windfall. And then you look, and because they count, of course, real estate as capital. Real estate gets counted as capital in the data, and then you wind up saying capital,
Hmm.
quote unquote, is expanding. And again, instead of this bizarre story about business and rich people in general making doing especially well in the post-war period, it's government strangling a sector, messing it up, and then, as is often the case, the free market gets blamed for this stuff.
So there seems to be a move towards these views on housing. So there's the YIMBY, I guess,
Yes.
movement now. And there seems to be quite a few kind of leftist economists that seem to be moving in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any change on the ground? Are we seeing any real, reforms?
A bit. Right. So the main things that people have been talking about a lot are California, Oregon, and Minnesota getting rid of single family zoning, basically saying that you're allowed to go and put more than one residence on a single piece of property.
Hmm.
Uh, if you read the fine print, at least for California, they they add some additional details that really undermine the actual deregulation. This one is rich, like in the metaphorical, or impoverishing. So like what the rules say is that if you want to go and split your house into multiple houses, up to four under the new regulations, you must continue to occupy your home during the construction. Right. So you are not allowed to sell out to a developer and have them do the work. And the state of California, actually, they put an official statement out about why they're doing this, which is to ensure the gains go to the owner. Right. And if you're just squinting with disbelief, this makes about as much sense as if I find oil in my property, I have to drill it myself rather than sell it out to someone who actually knows what they're doing. So, like, obviously, the real function of this is to reduce the number of people that want to actually subdivide their property. But still, like, honestly, I am I'll take what I can get kind of person. And just to
Hmm.
see any improvement in this screwed up world does at least seem better. So better than nothing. Um, there's like, I mean, I hear people from other countries telling me things are happening, and then it's like I feel like I don't know enough about the country to know how big or meaningful the change it actually is. I mean, I'll say like the ideas are floating around. Um, I mean, it is striking because, yeah, you're right that the YIMBY movement definitely does lean left. It's a very strange case where they actually got on board with the idea of allowing industry to go and build more housing. Often it does get combined with support for other things that we would agree are a bad idea, but
Yep.
It's like, at least it's a mixed bag of some good stuff with some bad stuff instead of just a unmitigated bag of disaster, which is what I tend to expect a left-wing group to be pushing.
Yeah.
But let's see. Yeah, but like the fair thing to say is that the places in the so YIMBY movements tend to be big in the places that are worst. So basically, they're starting in places where
Yeah.
regulation's terrible, and they're trying to make it a bit better. The places in the U.S. that are the best are actually places like Texas, where most people don't even think about it as a policy. It's just that's the way it's always been, and they accept it. So one thing I'm trying to do with this book is to make people in states and areas where the housing regulation is better to be proud of what they're doing and say, look, we might like we've actually stumbled into something awesome here. And now maybe we should talk about being more awesome already. We're not going to let Californians beat us at this. So that's something that I can hope for anyway.
Are there any reasonable arguments that the other side makes?
See, look, honestly, I say, look, there's endless reasonable arguments because most complaints that people have about developments are not completely wrong. It's like if you build a 10,000 apartment units here, parking and traffic will be worse. It's like, yeah, you're right. Like you'd have to be pretty blind to deny it. This is where I will say, all right, there is a much better solution to this, which is to go and charge market prices for driving and parking.
Yep.
Even if government's still owns the stuff, we now have the technology to vary the prices of these things by any amount based upon actual conditions.
And where you actually drive, you can GPS
Yeah.
these things so you know exactly where you're driving and charge you based on that.
Yeah, so totally. So of course people hate this too, but like it's like what's so bad about charging people at higher prices to drive and park during peak times? And it mostly is it's just not fair to the poor. It's like, so it's better for houses to cost $1 million and driving and parking are free than for it to be half that cost, and then they have to pay a bit extra to drive and park if they actually want to, which maybe they won't.
Yep.
So there's that, right? So then, the driving and parking are, I think, the ones where, like, if you just imagine keeping the current system, it does cause a problem. I would still say, even if we keep current systems of driving and parking, just deregulate as much as we possibly can, and then I think these downsides are nothing compared to the gains. I think the other one, of course, is, well, we don't want to have a bunch of kids going in public schools that cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one where, again, like the inconsistency of the argument is like, well, why do we have public schools? To make sure the poor kids can get a good education. So then why do we prevent people from building? Because then then poor kids might come and live here and get the education that we're giving them. It's
absolutely.
Like, okay, like make up your minds here. Like this is at a level where like it's like you've got two totally inconsistent ideas in your head. Like, how about you go and you cut the subsidies and let people live there? Like, how about that? But no, that's like a bridge too far for people. There is at least one cool econ paper saying that, contrary to popular belief, apartments actually are a fiscal gain to the areas that receive them. I think because you get enough single people and retirees that more than cancels out all of the extra kids that you get. So I haven't gone through the math of the paper, but it's the best paper that I know of on this.
And you'd think that the parking and driving problem is going to get smaller as we move towards, I don't know, autonomous vehicles and Uber and stuff like that.
Yeah, so yeah, it's true. Like technology may just coincidentally save us. It's sort of unrelated.
Yeah.
But like the other big thing that I really want to tell people is, right, look, suppose that all your complaints are true about every bad thing that's going to happen. Suppose there's nothing we can do about them. It's either build and live with the problems or stop building and avoid the problems. There's something that you're forgetting here, which is that when you build stuff, it causes a bunch of negative things. It also causes a bunch of positive things. Now, like positive things like what? Well, like there's more restaurants in an area where there's more population to support the restaurants. There's more business. There's more cultural amenities. You've got more kids more kids in the neighborhood for your kids to play with, so you don't have to drive them to play dates.
Yep.
Now, this is one where you can say, all right, well, there's positive and negative. Who knows what the balance is? I say there's a very good argument that we know what the balance is and that it's positive. And here's the argument. You're familiar with the saying that actions speak louder than words.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, think about your typical complaining New Yorker saying, oh, it's so terrible to live here. The traffic, the noise, everything's awful. All right. Well, I've got a solution for you. Move out to the middle of nowhere and people will never bother you again. You can solve all these problems by just moving to another much cheaper home, but you don't want to, do you? Why
Mhm.
not? Because when you move, you lose all the negatives, you also lose all the positives. So most people are willing to pay a large upcharge to get the package of all the good and all the bad, which really does show, like, it's easy to say, well, it's just your opinion versus my opinion. Like, no, it is my opinion and it's your opinion. You don't agree with you, is what I often want to tell people. Is look, just look at your own behavior. You have, if you really cared, you have something that a way to change your behavior that would reveal it. You haven't done it, so you don't actually care anywhere near as much as you say.
So, talking about people moving, let's talk a little bit about immigration, right? I mean, a topic I'm sure you get a lot more flack for than housing. One that people seem to be unbelievably passionate about.
Mhm.
How did that book do?
Yeah, well, it's a New York Times bestseller, so it did
It
great.
was. Wow.
Yes, and I get to the rest of my life, I get to say I'm a New
Yeah.
York best-selling author. I was
It
only on
was
the
a
list
fabulous
for
book. So
for
I
1 month,
really
but
enjoyed it.
yeah, that's all I need.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so that was a book where, again, there was just a lot of research out there, and I thought, look, there's many pieces of it don't seem interesting taken by themselves. Basically, there's a lot of bricks, and each brick you look at, oh, it's just a brick. Who cares? And what I wanted to do is to combine those bricks into a structure. And the structure is one showing how amazing immigration is, how underrated it is, how even people that we think of as pro-immigration, usually they don't really even come close to appreciating how awesome it is. So, I mean, really, that book begins with a simple insight, not original to me, but when I first heard it, I just was, wow, right? And it's just this. Right. So just think about a Haitian living in Port-au-Prince shining shoes. Right. He's making, like, if he's like, he's making, like a couple dollars a day. All right. And now imagine that he just gets a piece of paper that entitles him to work in the US. He's going to be able to scrape together the money to get over here. And pretty much the day he shows up, he will multiply his income by a factor of 10.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And you look at it like, and so the guy's not changed. He's the same guy. He still is speaking French Creole. He's just shining shoes. He's doing the same job he's doing back home, but his income is now dramatically higher. It's like, how can that even be? How is that possible? Right. Non-economists tend to think of it as, well, there's like mean employers in Haiti, nice employers in the United States, but almost no one who appreciates economics is going to buy that story. It's like, well, look, people in the US are not running businesses as charities any more than they are in Haiti. It's
Mm-hmm.
got to be the case that what's going on is that Haitians' productivity is much higher in the United States than it was back home. The same guy, like
Yep.
whatever
Doing the
issues he's
same thing.
got, he might be illiterate or not speak English or whatever. He might be stunted because he got poor nutrition as a child. And yet that one human being, suddenly his productivity massively increases, because that's basic economics. It's why people pay you, is because you can produce stuff. Right. And then when you think about it a bit more, it's like, all right. So for agriculture, it's super easy to see how migration raises productivity. You take someone working on a primitive family farm, move them to modern American agribusiness, they grow 10 times the food. All right. No mystery. Same thing with manufacturing. Take someone doing low tech manufacturing in like a home production or something like that, cottage industry, move them to a modern American factory. Again, they're producing tremendously more. With the guy shining shoes, that's the only one where it's a bit hard to understand what happened. There you have to remember, well, the point of a service is to save time of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
You save the time of someone whose time is more valuable, you become more productive to humanity. You can save 5 minutes of Bill Gates' time. You have done a lot more for the world than when you save 5 minutes of my time. And that's what's going on with services. Right. So this is just the first step of looking at immigration. But I will say, look, if you hear this and you don't care, then I just don't know what to say to you. Like, it was like, you don't care that a human being can produce 10 times as much stuff if you just stamp his passport legal to work. Right now, they're like, does this settle it? Of course not. It's a complicated issue. But this is where it's like, so we could go, and then it's like so like some people say, well, only the immigrant gains. Like, that's not the way economics normally works.
No.
Like, if a guy opens a restaurant, only the guy who owns the restaurant gains. Like, no, there's
Mm-hmm.
consumer surplus, consumers gain. And in fact, we know from all of economic history, here is a big claim I will make, that I know of no exception to any case where there was a large increase in total production that did not wind up being broadly shared.
Mm-hmm.
No case. So it's like, tractors did not just benefit farmers. Clothing manufacturing, so textile manufacturing did not just benefit the owners of the factories. The internet doesn't just benefit programmers. Vaccines don't just benefit pharmaceutical companies. Anytime there's a large increase in production, there is the gain is widely shared. So that's where you say, look, well, you don't care that there's going to be some large increase in the production of humanity. Because, remember what I'm telling you. I'm not saying that if a Haitian moves to the US, Haiti gets poorer, the US gets richer. That would just be zero sum. I'm saying that Haiti gets a little poorer and the United States gets a lot richer because of that change in productivity. Right now, at this point, the only reasonable question in my mind is, all right, so we can do this for one person.
Yeah, I was going to
we
say
can do
that.
it. All right, can
What
we
if
do it for 10
all
people?
the Haitians move here?
Yes, and this is where there start to be objections that are at least not crazy, and that's what I try to deal with in the book. I did actually get to have a fun talk with a very smart guy who's anti-immigration named Noah Carl, and he allowed me to run it as a cross-examination, where I was able to go and say, okay, here's the first argument. Do you agree with that part? And all right, now, and he's like, okay, yes, that's okay. And then I would, it was a very productive conversation in my mind because I got to actually keep making further arguments and then find out when did he start drawing the line. Like, honestly, the main line that really does make sense to at least ask about is there some number of immigrants that you can let in where it just winds up crashing the system somehow?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then there's sort of the mundane version where if you're Luxembourg and you let in 50 million immigrants, they'll all be living in the streets. It'll be impossible to drive and you'll starve
Why would they come?
because it destroys transportation. So that's sort of the most, it's one where it's like, okay, like if it all happened overnight in that way, then fine, then there'd be a problem there. But usually what people have in mind is the immigrants will come and destroy the entire political system by voting for terrible policies.
Yep.
Right? And this is one that I take very seriously. Like a lot of my work has been about this question. I'm not someone who's just going to say can't happen. People never vote for bad stuff. It's like, no, people vote for bad stuff all the time. This is one where I'll say, look, right. First of all, it's not a question of whether they'll vote for bad stuff. It's are they worse than the people already in your country? Since all electorates are bad, they got to be worse than what you've already got. So like when occasionally people act like the US already is a wonderful free market system, and then immigrants will come and vote for socialists. Like, we're already pretty socialist. So
where do they live? Yeah.
Yeah. And like, have you talked to your fellow Americans? They're already pretty bad. So let's at least remember how much of a change we're talking about here. It's not from Gulch to Venezuela that we're talking. We're talking about a system that's already pretty messed up politically. And then are these people actually going to make things worse or not? Which is, I think, the reasonable thing to ask. And then multiple other sub-questions, which I do try to address in the book. So one is like, well, how much will first-generation immigrants actually even participate? We've got a lot of evidence that first-generation immigrants generally are not very political.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So secondly, so what about their kids? How much will they assimilate? So that they will be at least no worse than people that are already here. Right? And I say also, we got good evidence for quite high levels of assimilation. So you've got that too. And then, finally, this is an argument, so it's not totally clear that it's true, but I think the preponderance of the evidence is still on its side. And this one says that if you are someone that is critical of the welfare state, as perhaps someone who wrote Equal is Unfair would be, I'm just guessing. All right, but if you're critical of the welfare state, there's a lot of evidence that one of the main underpinnings of the welfare state is the idea that you are a national family. The idea that we are all one people, we're all together, we're all responsible for each other. And on the other hand, one of the main things that tends to undermine the welfare state is the sense of, no, we're individuals, we aren't a family, we're different people. All right. So anyway, a lot of this research actually comes out of Scandinavia from quite left-wing Scandinavian social scientists saying, like, on the one hand, we like immigration, but on the other hand, it's sort of undermining our sense of being a one Swedish people. Right. And I'd say that like a reasonable version of this is that there's very little sign that immigration has anywhere actually made the welfare state decline, but there's good evidence that immigration has made the welfare state grow at a slower pace. And it is precisely along the idea of, like, I'm willing to go and pay high taxes to support my fellow Swedes or my fellow Norwegians, but I'm not willing to pay high taxes to go and support immigrants who aren't really part of our people at all. I mean, I've done blog posts on like, what is the best general attitude for people to have for a free society? And I say, look, obviously you don't want people to hate each other. That's bad. But on the other hand, if everybody really loves each other, like people in a family love each other, that's really dangerous for freedom too. It's like if you needed your parents' permission to go and do mountain climbing, could you get it? It's like they love you too much. They say, no, like it hurts me too much to let you take these risks with your own life, so I'm not going to allow you to do it.
Yep.
So that's, I think, is a reasonable story. The immigration actually does tend to undermine the welfare state. There are a few papers saying this is probably one of the main reasons the US welfare state is more restrained than the European one, because we do have less of a sense of being a single, united people. We have more of a sense of individualism. Usually, though not always, the authors of this research are saying, and it's just a shame in the Americans.
That's bad, yeah.
Right. I mean, often it's tied into the idea that racism is why the U.S. doesn't have a bigger welfare state. And I'll say, look, none of your evidence really shows that Americans are racist. What it shows is that they have less of a sense of exaggerated responsibility to people of other races, right? Which is different from disliking people, right? It's one thing to say that everyone of my ethnicity is, is like someone who belongs, is part of my group. It's another one to say everybody who's not in it are people I hate. So I think there's little evidence for that. But there is an idea that Americans just have more individualism, and probably having more ethnic diversity is one of the pieces of the puzzle about why we do feel this way. So I think it is at least part of the story about having a freer country is to have a lower sense of national unity. Right? I mean, like it's always odd to me, like free market people just say, no, that's too high of a price. And it's like, well, let's go through the countries on earth that historically have seemed most firmly united. They're terrible.
They're the most statist of all of them.
Like North Korea doesn't have unity. I mean, they're not as united as they look, but yeah, I think they got some pretty impressive unity over there. And
I mean, there's a sense in which the U.S. had unity around the idea of individualism, but that's what made the country extraordinary in some sense.
Look, could be. I mean, I tend to think that philosophers over-intellectualize what was going on in the past. So like from reading 19th century actual American politics, I don't really see that much sign that if you went in to propose going and having government do something, they would go and say, no, it violates principles of individualism. It was more of just, well, we don't really do that here.
Yeah.
Which, like you might say, well, it's still kind of individualism. Like it could be. Like honestly, like I just had like my view of like people's policy views is that if someone just speaks in generalities anyway, like I don't really trust your commitment. Like simply this way, like when Frederick Bastiat says that he opposes government, that guy opposes government because he's going to go and say like I'm against tariffs, I'm against quotas, I'm against conscription. He's going to go list a whole bunch of specific policies that are popular that he's against. Whereas someone like Thomas Jefferson says it, I'm like, I don't know, like maybe, or like Thomas Paine is a clear example because we know what he wrote about the French Revolution. Like he starts off going and sounding totally individualistic, and then without any seeming sense of contradiction or change of heart, he's talking about having an early universal basic income.
Yep.
Yeah. So rhetorically, Thomas Paine is great, but it's like you're just not specific enough for me to really trust what you're saying, in the same way that well over 90% of Americans say they're for free speech, but they say, how about free speech for racists? Oh, not them. All right. So it's, I actually, this is one where there's like, I think it's the survey of the First Amendment, general thing, favor of free speech, like 95% yes.
Yep.
And like, what about for speech that might tend to inspire racism?
Might tend to inspire.
Might tend. And it's like, and then you suddenly have like this large share saying, well, no, not that. Yep. It's like, so basically you don't really believe in free speech except as a slogan.
So what do you make of, I don't know if you dealt with in the book, kind of Islamic immigration to Europe in large numbers, where they are now in the streets demanding Sharia law in Germany or stuff like that. Does that just qualify as what you said before about they'll vote bad policies in?
Right. I mean, what I say is we have to actually look at the numbers. if we're at a level where I think there's a serious risk of civil war or something like that, 10% of actual civil war, and it's
Mhm.
like, all right, it's like this is just this is really unfair, and there's a bunch of people who are totally innocent, but we're talking about like an absolute catastrophe. On the other hand, if it's just there's some demonstrations on the news and it just winds up fading into history and not much comes of it, because in every free society there's endless horrible demonstrations, almost all of which come to zero
Sure.
at the end.
So you'd be for some limitations if there was a sense of civil war, collapse of
Yeah, I mean,
society,
of
something like that.
course.
Yep.
So yes, like I mean, so I'm not a utilitarian or consequentialist. I'm also not someone who believes in absolute human rights.
Mhm.
My view is what philosophers would call weak deontology, where it's like there's a prima facie right which does not need to be justified based upon overall social benefit, but if the harm gets sufficiently horrible, that's where it's like, all right, I guess unfortunately we're gonna have to make an exception in this case. Although it's also where, given this mindset, it's like, well, what's the smallest exception we can make? What's the mildest exception? Rather than just doing what I think is the default of we see an Islamic protest in Denmark and say, all right, so therefore no one
Build
can
a
come
wall.
here again.
Build a wall.
Yeah. So I mean, like this is one where I'd say like there's a lot of things that are worth saying, but like just a few things to start. Like there are a lot of people in Muslim countries who don't like it there
Hmm.
and would like to live in a freer society.
Absolutely.
Right? So you can even go and look at, you can look at public opinion and say, well, 90% favor the death penalty for apostasy. What do you think those 10% are like?
Yeah.
Right? 10% of people who are saying no. It's like maybe you'll say maybe they're just a little bit less bad. On the other end, maybe they're people who just hate those countries and just say like, I want to get out of here. Right. So, and just to act like those people don't exist seems to be, I guess, a very strange attitude to me. I mean, it's one if you say, well, we really would like to let them in, but we don't want to let the other ones in. What can we do about it? I mean, just if there was someone that said that, I like at least my reaction would be, all right, you appreciate the gravity of the situation, you appreciate the opportunity, you appreciate the injustice, the status quo, and let's start thinking about what could be done. Right. So that's where I would start. I mean, but I think honestly, like most of the actual reaction is driven very journalistically. I'm someone who has a deep philosophical aversion to all mainstream news, just because I mean, and I think I'll say it's definitely like very close to my least favorite product, product of the free market.
Hmm.
It's like like the media really does consist in, let me find the worst thing that happened on a planet with 8 billion people and show
Absolutely.
it to people and insinuate like it's super important and everyone should care about it and government should do something about it.
Mhm.
And that is the way that the media operates.
And
Aside
let's
from having,
generalize from one concrete, right? So
yes,
let's
so,
one immigrant has committed a
right,
crime and all immigrants are evil.
yes. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite examples of this, I was actually invited to a very strange conference called the Writers' Workshop. Have you heard of this, Yaron?
No, no.
It's basically the umbrella organization for every anti-immigration group in the United States.
Okay.
Right. So you know who John Tanton was?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's sort of the Johnny Appleseed of anti-immigration movements. So like,
Yeah.
oh, let's start a labor union one. Let's start an environmental one. Let's start a nationalist one. Just like whatever reason you can have to be against immigrants, I'll go and get you all started. This is the convention where they all get together. I was brought in to be the devil's advocate. Right. But anyway, later on that day, there was a panel where everyone on the panel was going to be someone whose family member was murdered by an illegal immigrant. Right now, I wasn't on this panel,
Ugh.
but like it's like on the one hand, like to actually imagine being on that panel and trying to argue with them, it's like, my God, like what would Ayn Rand have said to them? Even she might have been a little bit,
Well, you don't go on panels like that.
yes,
There's no upside to a panel like that, right?
yes, but I mean, but like intellectually, it is no different from let's go on a panel where of everyone whose family members were murdered by Jews, and so let's go and get rid of Jews. It is the same mentality, and
Yep.
yeah, it is a terrible argument. I mean, like another one that just seems crazy to me is someone's like, there's honor killings happening. It's like,
Mhm.
well, what do you think would be happening to those women if they stayed home? Right. So yeah, there's like there you go.
Well, and if they're on a
If you keep them all out, there will be zero honor killings, but like inside of your borders. But you haven't done a favor to the actual people that are in this situation.
no, and here he will at least go to jail, and
Yeah.
there he will, he will continue to do it, right?
Yeah.
He's not going to jail.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
at least
and of course, for every
for
woman that
justice.
does die in an honor killing, there's probably hundreds that justify their family and get away with it and get to live their lives.
Yep.
Right. So, I mean, it is worth pointing out that when there are native-born protests of a horrifying nature, people basically just shrug and say, yeah, that's democracy or whatever. And I think the shrugging is good in the sense that it does mean that they don't want to go and start doing mass arrests of people just for their beliefs. And it does, and people realize, look, the system is not so fragile that having a big movement that is obvious, the anti-Vietnam War movement, I think it's very fair to say that the leadership is pretty much taking orders from Moscow. And yet, and and at the time that was near the minimum of the U.S. foreign-born share in the course of about 200 years. And
Yep.
yet it's like, all right, well, but they're native-born kids that are going and repeating a bunch of Soviet propaganda. So what can you do? Right. And yeah, on the one hand, it's terrible to see a big protest of people repeating totalitarian propaganda. On the other hand, it is important to keep your head and say, just because they have their stupid protest doesn't mean that they're going to win.
Yeah, it's only an issue of numbers. I mean, if the numbers get so bad as that they actually could impose that
Yes.
totalitarian ideology. But yes, I mean, the numbers are nowhere near that in Europe.
Right. And then also the assimilation. It's so easy to go and put the unassimilated or just negatively assimilated immigrants on TV or in newspapers. It's like, his parents were both westernized doctors, but he joined ISIS. All right, yeah, that's a better story. But what about all of the kids of fundamentalist parents who actually became secular? So, I had a student who actually was going over British data, and his estimate was that about 25% of Britons who were born Muslim apostatized by adulthood.
Yeah.
Now you'd say, well, 75% didn't. 25% apostasy from religion is really high in one generation. If you keep that up for a few generations, the religion disappears.
And yeah, I mean, people I think underestimate the power of being free, being free a little bit, right? Even in our Western countries, how living in London is different than living in the Middle East. Yeah, the kids notice. The parents might just get by, but the kids notice, and they will change.
Right. And also, one of the things that bugs me the most is the way that even free market people often just forget about the role of the welfare state in preventing assimilation. One of the very best ways to assimilate a person is for them to get a job where they actually where they work where they're probably working alongside people from that country. Even if they're not, they got a lot of customers of people that are natives of the country, and you just have to learn to get along with other people. That is one of the best kinds of assimilation out there. And the welfare state does allow people to often permanently just never assimilate. So you say it's terrible they're living in their ghettos, just continuing in their old ways. It's like, look, I understand why you object to that, but in fact, I object to it too. But why then is it that you want to focus on getting rid of them instead of change the welfare state? Almost the only reply I've ever had from people is, oh, limiting the welfare state is a pipe dream, but ending immigration is easy. And it's like, that's not true. We already have a bunch of limits on the welfare state. We can turn that dial up. And on the other hand, the last time there was a fundamental change in U.S. immigration policy was 1965.
Yep.
So I think it is much more of the thing that you really want to do is the thing that you say is doable. And the thing that would actually be more effective, it's like, well, I don't really want to do that anyway. I have talked to conservative critics of immigration where it's like, look, we don't want to do I actually like the welfare state within at least up to a reasonable level. And if we had to go and cut it back, that would be yet another harm of immigration. It's all right. Well, for you, it's going to be harder. But for anyone who is anti-welfare state and pro-immigration, I think there is a pretty clear path forward of, I
agree.
Right, which which can be called the shock doctrine. You probably know about Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. I think that she's wrong to actually say it's happening, but it's like, gee, I wish. Let's shock them.
Absolutely wish. It isn't. I mean, the countries that find it most difficult to assimilate, particularly in Europe, are the countries that have the most generous welfare and for immigrants. And Sweden discovered that by having these amazingly generous welfare. They keep them out of the workforce, and then they're surprised that they're not assimilating. I mean, work is the number one assimilating factor.
Yes. I mean, to be fair, Europe is not a total socialist hellhole in general. And so, it's definitely the case that labor force participation for foreign-born is low by U.S. standards, but it's nowhere near zero. It's more like 40 for a lot of these countries. And yeah, if you go to any of these countries, even with large welfare states, you'll see a lot of immigrants that have jobs and are working.
Yep.
And actually, of course, something else going on is often the underground economy where they're working in a restaurant illegally. It's like, all right, so they are working. I can understand the complaint of they're collecting benefits and also working at the same time. And like, well, who created this crummy system?
Yep.
All
right, so we've already gone an hour. I've got two other topics, and we got a few questions. So you wrote a book called Selfish Reasons to Have Kids. So I'm curious if you could give us a quick overview of what those are. These days, a lot of talk about demographic collapse and everything. So what are selfish reasons to have kids?
So it's specifically selfish reasons to have more kids.
More kids.
So more kids than you're otherwise planning on having.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. So key premise. So like, I'm not going and trying to talk people into liking kids who just don't like kids at all. I think that's hopeless. Instead, this is a book for people who have some interest in having kids, but don't want to do it because the cost in terms of lifestyle and money is too high. Now, here is the argument. Right? It's got it has an unusually large number of steps, but I think I can spell it out. Within these confines. Just starts off with especially in terms of the lifestyle cost of having kids, there's a lot of evidence that it's just a lot higher than it used to be. So in the 60s, it would be, or 50s even, parents would basically just tell their kids, go play outside. And we actually have the data backing this up, that it was just a lot easier to raise kids in the past. It was just a lot less work. Parents had a lot more time to do whatever else they were going to do. It's risen a lot. And it's like, well, what's going on? And I say, look, there's really only one plausible explanation, which is that parenting philosophies have changed. There's been a change in the philosophy of parenting. And what is the change? The change is to this idea that unless you go and make incredible investments in your kids' future, that they will be losers. That parenting is the key to success in life. All right, so this is a theory. It could be true, it could be false. It's just been accepted as being correct by most, definitely most middle and upper class families in first world countries. Probably actually in East Asia, I think they actually are the craziest believers in this. It's like everything, my child's entire future is in my hands. I have to give up everything for them. And they have to have their childhood must be pure drudgery and suffering, or else their adulthood will be miserable. But anyway, I went and discovered that there is, besides, of course, thousands of years of philosophers talking about nature versus nurture, why do kids turn out the way that they do? Why do kids resemble their parents? That's true. Kids do on average resemble their parents, but why is that? So anyway, for thousands of years, we basically just have philosophers going and making it up and saying, well, the answer is this, the answer is that. But around 1960, there were researchers in a large number of fields who said, you know what? The problem is that in a normal family, you combine biology and upbringing, and so we can't really disentangle these two forces. So we don't really know why kids in ordinary families grow up resemble their parents. But there are abnormal families. There are families that adopt kids, so they've got upbringing shared, but they don't have any genetic share, any shared genes. We've got identical twins who have double the normal share of similar genes than ordinary siblings. So anyway, so what they did is they took advantage of this variation to start trying to estimate and actually answer this longstanding question of why do children resemble their parents? And the big punchline is this: especially in the long run, people greatly underestimate the power of genetics and greatly overestimate the power of nurture or of upbringing. All right. Now, since I know that we're both believers in free will, I actually have a post on further exploring this. Here is a fun fact. There is no notable trait where identical twins raised together are identical, which does not prove free will, but it's very highly consistent with free will anyway. It's like, we got the same genes, we got really similar environments, they're doing different things. Like, what's the determinist theory of that? And it comes down to one day we'll go and figure out a way to pay this blank check that we've written. But in any case, there's definitely is the similarity. So I say that it is the standard view that nurture is all important and genetics are not very important is wrong. It's pretty much the opposite. I mean, probably the normal view is that physical similarities are genetic, and anything psychological or social is upbringing. And that's just totally wrong. Right. So intelligence is one of the most highly heritable traits ever measured. It is basically in the same ballpark as height. And we can say similar things for a lot of other traits. Now, most people just read this out of curiosity about why human beings turn out the way they do. But as an economist, I looked at it and I said, this is actually an opportunity for people to rethink, first of all, their parenting style. Because it means that people are making a lot of investments in their kids on a false theory that the investments are highly effective in changing their kids' future, and they're not. But then secondly, here's the thing where I really was thinking like an economist, which is that, look, all right, if someone goes and gives you a coupon for chocolate 25% off, step one is use the coupon to buy as much chocolate as you're going to buy. But step two is say, maybe I want more chocolate. Given that the price is actually lower than I previously believed it was, I don't want to just go and take advantage of the lower price. I want to go and take advantage of an opportunity to go and make a larger purchase because it's now a better deal. And this is why it's called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. It's saying, look, if what's holding you back is this cost in terms of lifestyle and money, then you are not wrong to think it's going to cost you more than zero. It will. But the cost that you see people paying around you is based upon a false theory of what's necessary to do to give your kids a decent life. And you can totally, without harming your kids' long-run interest, go and cut back a lot, give yourself a more pleasant life, not spend nearly as much money on piano lessons or private school or whatever else you're talking about. And then maybe if you do that, it'll turn out that having an extra kid is actually worth it for you. So that is the whole argument.
And so the idea is in raising kids, we should return to the kind of style of the 60s and let the kids go play.
Yeah, or 50s, 60s. I mean, really, like almost all of human history before then. Right? Honestly, this idea that it's up to parents to go and give their kids their future is quite recent. And like a lot of people say, like in today's competitive environment, blah blah. Like no, like that is not the actual. That is just that is a lot of that is a theory which is hard, which just using observation is hard to test. By the way, there's also some like when you go and read the actual empirical research. One thing that's really cool is that they generally find the short-run effects of parenting are much longer than the long-run effects, which does help to explain this illusion of parents having so much power. I mean, like one of the most, this one I think you'll like, Yaron. So there's a paper on the effect of upbringing on children's religiosity. All right, and big surprise here. If you go and try to predict the effect of the religiosity of the parents and the religiosity of the kids when they're like 10 years old, then yeah, it's really strong. Definitely in terms of church attendance. If your parents go to church, you probably go to church. Sure. And if your parents believe something, you probably will too. But what this study did is it looked at people at older ages, and they found a lot of apostasy again. A lot of people who are raised religiously don't stay religious in adulthood. In the short run, it seems like there's a strong effect of parenting. But in the long run, a lot of people actually break out of that.
Makes sense. Yep.
Right. And many people just say, like, so you're saying that religiosity has a genetic component. It's like, well, look, can you believe that personality, there's something the genes have some effect on personality? Well, don't you think that religiosity, it's a lot like a personality trait where, there are some people who just go through life saying, oh, there's a God-sized hole in my heart. How will I ever fill it? And other people saying like, I don't like this nonsense. Right? And
happened to me.
That can be learned to some degree, but also like with some people, it just seems very deeply rooted.
Yeah.
If you just always remember, like I always felt this way. Like here's my confession. Like I can't remember a single like any time in my life so young that I didn't just feel very arrogant. Like I was 5 years old. Like I was this way. Like I understand it can be a personality defect, but I'll just say, like I've always felt this way.
Yeah.
It wasn't like there was some time I read a book and it convinced me to start being this way. I always was.
It could also be choices you made back then, but yeah, it's so okay. So final question I have, and then we've got a few from here. I found this interesting. You wrote recently, I think, in one of your blogs that you don't consider yourself an Austrian economist. You're surrounded by Austrians at George Mason. You've obviously been, I think, trained by Austrian economists. and I think in many of our minds, you're thought of one. So why are you not? And what does it mean not to? So what are you? I guess if you're not an Austrian economist,
Right. I mean, I would say that I like like in terms of normal academic jargon, I'd actually say behavioral economist is the best description of me. I'm an economist who takes psychology very seriously. I think like without empirical psychology, economists really lack basic tools they need to understand what's going on in the world. I mean, just for things as simple as how come prices end in 99 cents? Like you
yeah.
got a theory that can explain that without some psychology, my hat is off to you. But I mean, just to back up,
But most behavior psychology, most behavior economists are going to be more interventionists, right?
yeah, like so let's say that is true, but it has almost nothing to do. In fact, I say it is less than nothing to do with the evidence they have, and more than 100% to do with the ideology they bring with them.
Sure.
You're believing is seeing. So yeah, you go and you find some psychological problems with humans, and you say, government should fix this. That'll work.
Yeah.
Right? But, like so, like the book that I'm writing right now, which we could talk about if there's time. Big theme is if you really understand both psychology and economics, it should make you much more libertarian. Not it should not make you a statist. It really is just a case of the ideology of the people of the founders of the field was left wing, and then of course being left wing, they saw that the evidence supported them, but it's just like, well, only if you look at it in an extremely skewed and slanted way, then yeah, but otherwise, no. So anyway, so behavioral economist is in just sort of generic terms is where I put myself. I'd say it is not true that I'm surrounded by Austrian economists at George Mason.
Okay.
What we have is a big department of like 35 economists. And I'd say out of those, probably at most 10 would think of themselves as Austrian economists. Even there, I think that several of them, they like have some other terminology they like. So it's not true that they are a majority. I'd say that majority of people at George Mason appreciate the work of Austrian economists, which I do too. That's different from actually that is what I am. And then let's see. So let me come back to that. And then finally, so like I'll say, it's like I really was not trained by Austrian economists. I went to like a Mises University in 1989. I read a lot of Austrian economists, but my formal training, I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, zero Austrian economists there. PhD at Princeton, zero Austrian economists
there.
So yeah, so like I mean, I would say it is not true that I was trained in any formal sense. I've read a lot of Austrian economics, so I do think that I know it pretty well. In terms of first of all, what's the difference between appreciating Austrian economics and being one? So the key part of being one is thinking that's where most of the truth lies. And that the other stuff just isn't like, maybe there's something else out there, but basically more than half of what an economist needs to know is written by people who self-identify as Austrian. And I'll just say, yeah, that just seems pretty crazy to me. Like there's just most mainstream economics isn't very good. But there is, what's the name of the guy who has the rule? Like 95% of everything is crap. So I think there's a lot to that. Like it's easy to just to go and pick out a random article in academic econ and say, do you stand by this, Bryan? Like, no, of course not. Like that article looks terrible. Or like, at least like, I mean, my most common reaction is, I guess it's okay if you care about that topic, but who no one in the right mind would care about the topic.
Yeah.
But Austrian economists, they do tend to be people who think that over half of what's worth reading was written by people who self-identify in this way. And yeah, I think that that's just pretty crazy. There's just a lot of really good work that is written by people outside of that tradition. In terms of what I would say, like what really marks you as an Austrian economist, it's this idea that they've come up with a totally new paradigm that other economists aren't using. And that's the correct paradigm. And everything else built on the other paradigm is basically so wrongheaded that it's not worth reading. So I think, and that's something that I would just reject and say, look, first of all, it is true that some Austrians do have their own separate paradigm. What I did in this piece, why I'm not an Austrian economist, is say, look, insofar as you've got something that different, it's wrong. And what am I talking about? Like the kind of thing that you can think of it as your separatist Austrians, the Austrians who think like we've got like the truth is here in our camp, and at least there's not much of value outside of it. Like the kind of thing I'm thinking about is saying, for example, there's no such thing as indifference. it is impossible to be psychologically impossible to be indifferent between two things. And it's like, first of all, what are you talking about? And second of all, who even cares? And it's like, well, they've got this whole theory. Look, a preference can only be demonstrated through action. There's no such thing as an undemonstrated preference, and you
Yeah.
can never demonstrate indifference. Therefore, there is no such thing. And sometimes they'll say, well, there is one in a common sense, but not in a scientific sense. And they'll say, so in a common sense, when I say I'm indifferent between the red and the green sweater, is that true or not? I don't really care if it's science. I just want to know if is it literally true or not literally true. And
Mhm.
that's where I've gotten both answers from very staunch Austrian economists. Now, as to why do they even care about this stuff? You would be amazed at how far they think they can take this principle. So it's like, well, if there, so there's not indifference because there's no such thing as a preference that is not revealed in action. And from this, they say, and therefore the entire concepts of externalities, public goods, public bads that you'll get in mainstream economics, they're all just wrong. They're all just fundamentally false. They are
Oh, I
incoherent.
see.
So it's like,
Okay. Yeah.
and from there, it's like, and therefore I've proven there's no such thing as market failure, and then markets, and it's like, all right, so you're telling me that if like there's an asteroid coming for Earth and a philanthropic effort to go and deflect it fails to raise enough money, then that shows that it's actually better for the world to be destroyed by the asteroid because everyone's demonstrated through their preferences they don't want to go and contribute the money, and like that actually is the hard Austrian position. And I have so Rothbard is the one that is most explicit about this, but he's got a lot of followers, and I think he is
Sure.
actually correctly interpreting Mises, who was inconsistent on this, because Mises simultaneously has this stuff on preferences only exist in an action, but he
Mhm.
also does talk about what he calls external economies,
Yep.
which are the same thing that other economists call externalities.
Yep.
And and I say, look, the sensible thing is to say, of course, there's externalities everywhere. They're positive and negative, and they're caused by both markets and government.
Yep.
And just trying to go and win this definitional war for markets, it's a Pyrrhic victory at best. Like, why not like open your eyes and pay attention to the world? That's what I try to do.
Truth is what matters, not how you label it. Yeah.
Yes, and like truth is better than science, right? If you say, well, it's true, but it's not science, like okay, fine, like if that's the way you
Take
want
the
to play
truth.
it, I don't care.
Fuck
It's
the
just like
truth.
if it's true, then it doesn't need to be science, and if it's science and it's not true, then it doesn't matter. It's got to be like truth is actually the fundamental trait of value of something valuable to know, and everything else.
All right, so we got a few questions, and you guys can ask more while we're talking. Let's see. Shazbot says, going back to housing, Bryan, can you say, what can you say about illegal boarding houses, large houses that have been subdivided into single home rentals?
Let's see. So I don't remember reading anything specific about that, but I'll just give you my general answer. There are a number of standard traits of black markets. When something is illegal, then a number of problems arise. One is the people that are involved tend to be sleazy because if you're willing to go and risk jail time and harsh punishment, you probably are not that nice of a person otherwise. So this is a standard story about other kinds of prohibition. Then also, of course, when something's illegal, the market has a lot of ways of helping to certify quality. So there's reputation, there's warranties, there's guarantees. So when you make a market illegal, then you make it quite a bit worse in terms of these other traits. So yeah, someone that's running an illegal flop house is probably going to at least be someone you'd be a bit scared to be around. And second of all, yeah, like the quality in terms of what the customers are getting, as well as the quality of what kind of neighbors they're going to be, is going to be worse as well, in all likelihood. I would say that the standard solution to these problems of prohibited products is to legalize the products so markets can work.
Shazbot also asking, what's the theme in the 4 paintings behind you?
So these are selected by my wife, actually, not me, although I do like them. These are from different operas and operettas, all of them from, I think, I say around circa 1900.
Right. Alex, you often send out open invitations to meet and greets to your fans and whenever city or restaurant you're planning to go to. How many people typically go to meet you? Any concerns there will be more fans than you can handle?
Yeah, I'm not that big yet. So yeah,
Working on it.
yeah, right. So honestly, the single best predictor of turnout is population. So, I go to New York City. I wouldn't think of myself as being an especially popular guy in New York City, but yeah, that was one where I think I did one and like 20 people showed up.
Hmm.
But I mean, but like LA is also one where, it's high population. And so like, there, maybe it'll be, like 10 to 15 people. But yeah, like if I just go to a smaller city, then maybe it's like 2 or 3 people show up.
Yep.
Yeah, so yeah, like so really like population, like have you ever seen maps of the US and it shows like total number of motels in the area? Like standard economist thing is most maps are actually really just population maps if you're
Hmm.
doing it in terms of total numbers of something. So that's what I'd say is going on with most of my meetups. Yeah, it's never been a problem. I thought you were going to ask whether I'm ever scared of some psycho showing up. So far so good. So far, so
That's
good.
good. That's
Yeah, I mean,
good.
I have pinned this tweet just saying that like anyone who ever just wants to go and say hi to me in public, always feel free to do so. So far, so good, and just making friends is working out great for me. Like everything that I have in life is it really comes down to I've made a lot of friends, and that like
That's great.
allows me to go and do what I do.
Yep.
Like like basically, if you're doing something controversial, you better find somebody who's got your back, because otherwise you're left out to dry.
No kidding. Absolutely. All right. Alex says, I agree about nature versus nurture, but I'm skeptical of genetics as the driver. All genetics do is code for proteins. Surely there's a better theory to come down the line about where inherited personality traits come from.
Hmm. Well, so like here's what I'd say. The research that I use and the research that I honestly think is the most informative is studies of twins and adoptees. All right, and what's going on? So with adoptees, you got the comparison of here is a kid that does not share any genes with this family. Here's a kid that does share the genes. They're both raised by the family. What is the difference in similarity? Right. In the
Hmm.
case of twins, usually people are assuming these are separated twin studies. Those do exist and they're cool, but it's the number of people where that has happened to is quite low, generally in the hundreds. Most twin studies are doing something quite different. They're comparing identical versus fraternal twins that are raised by the same family. Right. So, and then basically what you're doing is you're saying if you have an extra 50 percentage points of genetic similarity, but you have the
Yep.
same upbringing, how much extra similarity do you have? Um,
Hmm.
so anyway, this is the kind of study that I rely on. There's also ones where they are really going down to the molecular level and getting actual details on what your genes are. Um, like, that's more cutting edge, and a lot of people like that more because it feels more sciencey to go and sequence your DNA and then use it to break something than to
Yeah.
go and get your twin status. But I say, look, for the question that people have been arguing about for a few thousand years, which is why do human beings turn out the way that they do, nature, nurture, I think actually the twin adoption studies are the ones that really speak to that because almost no one is wondering, well, which particular gene causes you to be tall? There are like it may be if we get down to the level of embryo selection, that does become an interesting question. But the reason why people in the past talked about this is they noticed, well, the people in the tall families from the tall parents tend to be tall themselves. Is it because tall people are rich and then they get more food and that's it? And if they got the normal food other people get, they'd be the same height as other people? Or was there something else going on? Could it be that if that father had gone and had that kid with a lower class mother and he had grown up in a lower class circumstance, he still would have grown up to be tall? Right. So for physical traits, I'd say that it's hard for me to understand what the methodological objection is to saying an extra 50 percentage points of genetic similarity will lead to this additional amount of height similarity. But then if you're willing to do that, then what about other things? So like you go and do IQ testing. It's like, well, right, we do IQ testing and we see that there is a very strong similarity in IQ between identical twins, even raised apart. Different environments, but if one twin is way above average, the other one is also likely to be almost as above average.
Hmm.
Personality is not as strong as that, but I just say that like once you go and like just go and say I don't want to do this for physical traits seems really hard to understand. It's like so like how could you even say there's something wrong with saying identical twins are more physically similar than fraternal twins and that's caused by their genes? And then to say, all right, how about some psychological traits that are very well studied, like intelligence? Seems hard to understand why that would be wrong if you can go and measure height? Why not measure intelligence and do that? Unless you got some philosophical objection to IQ testing or something like that, which again is not perfect, but the idea that it doesn't show something seems pretty hard to believe. And then finally, you got personality tests where, like, are they as good as IQ tests? No, of course not.
Yeah.
But still, when there's a lot of research on personality. Like, if you were just deeply skeptical of the measures, I would say just go and try doing the test and just see where you actually wind up being in the measured distribution. Like, you might say, well, like, everybody will give these answers that I give. Like, oh, whoops, actually, I'm in the 5th percentile of this thing.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, especially if you're an objectivist, you probably have a personality that is quite unusual relative to the population. I think, like, just reading your results, you may say, oh, yeah, I'm starting to really understand myself in a deeper way because of this. But then furthermore, there is some very cool research where they do things like they just give you a paper and pencil personality test at the age of 18, and then they use it to predict life outcomes. And yeah, like is it are you getting perfect predictions? Of course not. But are you getting things like, wow, like people who are in the 99th percentile of neuroticism have 5 times the suicide risk of a normal person? So this is you give them a test when they're 18 and they haven't done anything to themselves yet, but you say, all right, this person is at much higher risk, right? Or things like, and you really can use personality tests given a young age to get predictions about not just suicide, but divorce and unemployment and lots of other things. So it's like, all right, look, this stuff is better than nothing, and to go and throw it away because of a philosophical principle, or it sounds more like this was like a scientific one of it's like coding for proteins. Like, well, but
so I think it's the question of how do you translate, coding for protein, right? A materialistic kind of into personality traits, right? How do you
yeah. I mean, I'd say it's really no different than how do you translate coding for proteins into being tall?
Well, that you can kind of imagine the process by which that happens. I think that it's more challenging to figure out what the path is from there to a personality trait.
I agree. It's more challenging. Like, honestly, this is what people who do these gene-wide association studies are doing, is they're trying to find the exact genes to predict things. Even there, you might say, well, it still doesn't show why it has to be that way.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'd say, look, forget everything we know about genes and just look at different species of dogs. All right. And it's like, what are we raising the Dalmatians or to be helpful? Are we raising the Doberman Pinschers to be vicious? Maybe we give them some encouragement, but it's like, look, these dogs have been bred to be a certain way, and you don't need to know anything that you don't even need to know the genes exist to know that heredity is powerful. And that's actually how all these breeds of dogs generally came into existence. Like, if you look at a dachshund dog like that dog is bred to be a ratter. It's bred to be the right shape to kill rats.
Absolutely.
But also not just the right physical shape, the right personality to kill rats. Right now, by the way, so like none of this means there's no free will. And like this is actually one where I'm almost the only person who likes this research who even considers free will as a possibility. But like, look, like, you are aware that someone could be raised a certain way and yet still not do what they were raised to do. Right. Similarly, someone could be genetically inclined to be a way, but still not do it.
Sure.
Right. Like, are you aware? Like, so this is something where I have argued with objectives about this before. So I'm very big on the idea that instincts are real. So I think Rand was wrong about instincts. So like, look, like there wasn't some time. I don't think there was any choice that I made to be heterosexual. Like, I just think this is just the way I've always felt. You could say I made some choice at a young age, but it's like almost all animals are heterosexual too, non-human animals.
Yep.
So I think this is just an instinct. This is just the way that I feel quite automatically. But then there's still the question: do I have to act on it?
Yeah,
I can and do control my urges.
And it is interesting. I mean, philosophically, what do we mean by instinct, inclination? I mean, there's like 10 different things that you might be born with, not born with. What is what, and nobody's ever done the work to kind of categorize those things and figure out what's genetic, what's not, and.
Right. I did have a whole podcast with Greg Salmieri on whether human beings are indeed naturally selfish. And I'm on team. Yes, human beings are naturally selfish, just like.
Yeah, he told me about that. I haven't heard it, but I haven't listened to it. But yeah, he told me you had that discussion. Lone dissenter. that there's a cohort of leftists admitting that looser regulations equals more supply and helps the poor is amazing. They know it's true of everything. Do they know it's true of everything?
Hmm. I mean, I think the right answer to that is that, the minimum that what they would say, and what I would say too, is, look, the magnitude of the gains depends upon the severity of the regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have very heavy regulation, then there's big gains. If the regulation is mild, then there's only going to be mild gains. Then I think what most, I mean, not just left-wing economists, but most mainstream economists would say is that for a lot of the other regulation, right, so there's moderate cost, but we also have greater than moderate gains, and so it passes a cost-benefit test. Most economists are roughly utilitarian, or they're doing something else, which is efficiency analysis. But that's what. So I think that is what would be going on. Is at least for a lot of for saying, look, with housing, it's one where there's such high cost because the regulation is so strict, and on the other hand, the gains are, if they're at least not that big. I mean, I think I would still say I am unusual in really just pushing for laissez-faire.
Yep.
Which, I think very few economists, definitely few left-wing economists, are going to go that far.
Yep.
And that's one where I'll say that, I mean, I'm focused on the research that we got because I'd like to go and get a body of evidence that's broadly acceptable as well as solid. For a lot of the other stuff, I'll say it's just not getting studied that much. Like, people say, well, what about building codes? And I'll say, well, like, there's very few papers written on building codes. Probably the extra cost imposed by the building codes is nothing compared to the cost imposed by these other regulations, which are really strangling. But yeah, like, I think we should get rid of all building codes because, like, the free market will take care of it. We got reputation, we got guarantees, we got
Insurance.
certification, and last and least, we got lawsuits.
Yep.
And by the way, so on lawsuits, a lot of economists especially favor regulation just in the theory. But look, the problem with lawsuits is it's just a giant pain in the neck to file lawsuits. So for most problems, people just don't bother. And my story is, you're right. And that is a feature, not a bug, because human beings are just
That's
such
right.
complainers. They're so unreasonable and unfair that it is just a good idea to not try to say, like, does anyone here have any complaint about anything so that we can do something about it? It's much better to go and put the burden on complainers and say, look, you're going to have to really go the extra mile if you want to go and get your day in court.
Mhm.
So is that sometimes unfair? Sure. But I think just experience tells us that a system where it is easy to complain is just a dysfunctional system where you empower dysfunctional people.
Yep. All right. Thomas asks, what is the reason for the dramatic increase in house prices across America? Increased cost of home building material, foreclosure moratorium, homeowner assistance funds. Yeah, I think that's the question. So is it any of that? And let me just add to that. There is the kind of Austrian argument, I guess, that it's inflation, right? So that's where all the extra money goes. It goes into housing. I still hear that. Its housing prices have gone up because Biden and Trump's pumping money into the economy.
Right. So there's a basic model of markets in the short run versus the long run that you can get in any textbook, and it's very insightful. It says, in the short run, if demand goes up, prices go up, right? Just what you'd expect. Quantity goes up, just what you'd expect. The long run story, though, is when there is that short run shock, but when prices go up, that means that prices are temporarily above average cost. And anytime prices are above average cost, this is basically a giant loudspeaker blaring over the economy saying, enter this industry, perform this, supply this good at a basic level of competence, and there's free money on the table. And it keeps blaring until supply increases enough to go and get prices back down to cost. So the way this would be shown in a normal textbook is you've got the short run increase in demand, and then in the long run, however, then you have a large increase in supply, which then brings you back down to average cost. So basically, anytime you've got a story which is purely demand driven, it's really not a long run story. So no matter how much demand goes up, there's still the question, why doesn't business just produce more and more and more housing until it drives prices back down to average cost?
Yep.
And that is the puzzle that really got economists excited about this. Usually, like often the research really does begin saying, all right, well, let's see. Suppose you got a piece of land without government permits to build on it. How much does that cost? And yeah, it's like, yeah, if it doesn't have the permits, it's not worth very much. All right. And then it's like, right, then what is the physical cost of construction according to a standard model used by people in the industry? Like, so there's actually manuals where you go and find out how much it's cost according to the manual, which is not perfect, but it's something. All right. Then let's go and add up the cost of land without permission, physical land plus construction, and compare that to market prices. And that's where you'll see, especially in some place like San Francisco, it is a chasm between those two things. The physical cost of San Francisco's of building it is almost nothing compared to the price, right? And that's what the problem with all those stories. It's not that those can't be part of a short run story, but it doesn't really answer the question, why doesn't the market catch up?
Yep.
Why does the market not catch up to this pumping up demand, which then in the long run should bring it back down so that we wouldn't see the disparity, and yet we do see it and getting bigger.
Could it be that this is connected with the immigration story in the sense that there's also a labor shortage in terms of construction workers?
So most people want to flip it around and say, isn't this the real reason people are complaining about immigration, which is immigrants are driving up demand for housing and making housing expensive?
No.
I mean, really, like both stories, there's something to it, right? It's true that when immigrants come to an area in the short run, they drive up demand. And it's also true that immigrants that know how to build housing, when they show up in an area, they increase supply. So both of those stories are true. In terms of like, if there were more immigration in this industry, would this go and actually solve the problem? I'd say in areas where it's reasonably easy to build more, than it already is solving it. But on the other hand, more immigration in San Francisco isn't going to solve the problem, because the real issue is you can't get the permits to go and build anything. You could have 1 million people ready to go and build a skyscraper, but if the government of San Francisco will lock you up for trying to build it, then it doesn't really matter what you've got. So basically, those workers, those would go into the construction cost side.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an additional factor which would make things even better than this research that I'm talking about would say. It's basically like the research I'm talking about, like when they go and do physical cost of production, they are including everything that they're including things like building codes that raise the cost of housing. I was talking to an architect who was saying how if you want to build a skyscraper now, they have greatly expanded the size of the fire escape that you have to build, which might not seem like a bad deal, or a big deal, but he was saying it actually dramatically raises costs, because the fire escape must go up the entire height of the building. And if you make that area twice as big, if the skyscraper isn't that big to begin with, or maybe if it is bigger, they actually will say you have to have multiple fire escapes, each of which is then going and grabbing a large area space, which then can no longer be rented to paying customers. But anyway, all that stuff is actually just put into the cost of production. So that, if you think that's a bad idea, or at least really what I'd say, it's not so much a bad idea as let the free market take care of it. Right. But anyway, so that's something where it does give a greater potential. That particular architect, his estimate was all the land use stuff is raising prices 100%, and all the unreasonable building code stuff is raising it by another 20%, which sounds pretty good to me. But I don't have anything solid to base it on other than sounds good.
So Boaz asks pretty much the same question to all of my guests. Tips to burnt out parents of 2-year-old toddler to regain focus and motivation. And then thoughts on Musk, New York City, remote work, Bitcoin, AI, AR, VR, Biden, Trump, inflation.
All right. Let's see. So the first one is advice for
burned out parents of a 2-year-old toddler.
Exhausted parents of a 2-year-old. Let's see. So if you are the parent of a 2-year-old who's not yet sleep through the night, that should be your absolute number one priority. And there is a proven, highly reliable, evidence-based technique for doing this, which is the Ferber method. Right now, so actually experimentally tested, and it basically just means that if the kid cries, you don't go to them immediately and you let them cry for at least a moderate amount of time. The more extreme thing where you never go to a crying kid also works, actually. But what's nice about Ferber is that it's almost as effective as totally ignoring a crying baby, and at the same time is much easier for parents to do psychologically. So, I've known a lot of parents who just lost years of sleep, and if they really are exhausted at the highest level, it's just from sleep deprivation. And every parent that I know with sleep deprivation, it just comes from stubbornly refusing to go and actually train their kid to sleep through the night. Right.
Yep.
And zero evidence you're causing any harm to your child or anything like that. So it's just basically in terms of other things. Let's see. If you've got money to pay someone to help you, and almost if you're hanging out this podcast, listening to it, I think you have some spare money somehow, even if it's just you have some spare time that you could have turned into money. So the number of parents that just refuse to go and pay any money to anyone to help them just boggles my mind. And then like the number that refuse to even allow close relatives all the way down to their own parents to actually babysit when they want to babysit. It's like, are you out of your mind? Like this person raised you, like how bad could they possibly be? So like, and they want to help. So, I mean, there's a I think this principle actually is attributed to Italian political scientist Pareto. It's the 80-20 rule. And it's like the last 20% of parenting causes 80% of the pain. So it's just a rule of thumb, but pretty good. So yeah, like pay people to go and help you out, take advantage of free labor. Also, like, do not be ashamed to put your kids in front of a television and have them watch The Simpsons or whatever. Like, there's like, again, once you appreciate how little variation in upbringing actually matters for adult outcomes, it's highly impossible that you really are messing your kid up in any important way. So I just say then like, here's one other one, like moderate but clear, consistent punishments for bad behavior. I know parents who let their kids kick them and they don't do anything more than like they're there and like, yeah, the kid doesn't listen. Actually, I knew a criminology professor who just let her kid walk all over her and like, gee, yeah, I don't know about your understanding of criminology here. Like, this is again one where there are actual experiments done on kids that have behavioral problems, and there are, as far as I know, there's no experiments with
limits. Yeah.
So there's no experiments that even involve spanking that have been done, as far as I know. But there's plenty of experiments with put them in the naughty corner, and this stuff works. I didn't believe it myself until I tried it. I'm not saying it works with everybody, but there's this standard line about how well, it doesn't work. Have you tried? Have you tried? So I think a lot of what's going on with parenting is that people do things that are easier in the short run, but make their lives harder in the long run. And a lot of parents, I think, honestly, they punish their kid because they're having a bad day and they're feeling annoyed rather than as part of a policy. Don't do it because it should not be based upon how you feel. It should be based upon a rule that you clearly explain to the child in a way the child of that age can explain, and then do it all the time, whether you feel like it or not. That's, you are really doing yourself a favor if you do it that way. So anyway, those are just some things I would start with.
Good.
Right. And then let's see, there was a huge other list. Could you give me
There's a huge other list.
two or three best ones or ones you think that
New York City, remote work, Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, Biden, Trump, inflation.
Oh, all right. So let's see.
Pick what you want.
Well, so inflation, I know a bit about. So we had several decades of quite low inflation in the U.S., and a lot of economists got used, including me, honestly, got used to the idea it was just going to stay low forever. And then during COVID, there was an initial period where measured inflation was low, but I am one of the world's biggest promoters of the concept of CPI bias. CPI bias, it basically just says, look, there's a consumer price index. It's not crazy, but it's missing important things. Most notably, it ignores improving product quality.
Yep.
It ignores improvements in product variety, how we have more variety than before, ignores some other things. So when COVID began, this is where I wrote a piece saying that properly measured inflation is right now through the roof because product quality has crashed and product variety has really crashed. So actually, the right, intuitively, the right measure of inflation is just like the change in what your money buys you. And early in COVID, there was just a massive fall in what your money could really buy you. So, and then, of course, over time, things gradually, depending upon what state you're in, relaxed. And so, like, might be properly measured, actually, then after this unmeasured, barely discussed giant spike in true inflation, then things were actually improving for a while. But When people actually started getting angry was when we started to see measured rise in inflation.
Yep.
Now, this is interesting. Was, like I was paying very close attention to this because, I mean, honestly, when actual measured inflation started rising, this is where I said, all right, this is when markets are starting to actually work a bit better because there was an intermediate period that you might have noticed when prices were not going up very much, but there were many goods that used to be available in unlimited quantities, the market price, that suddenly became unavailable at any price. Right? This is a period where there's just a lot of what economists would call shortages, where I'm ready to pay the official price, but it's not there. Right? This is a classic feature of price controls where you go and you push down rents, and then officially the price of housing is really low, but in reality you just can't get it. The kind of thing that I would say behavioral economists have given us a lot of insight on is, look, that's one reason why prices stay too low. Another one is norms of fairness, saying I would be an evil person to go and raise prices during this time of crisis, as well as customers would flip out at me for doing it. The customers don't hate me when there's no toilet paper at all in the store, but they do hate me if I raise the price by 10%.
Yeah.
Well, if those are your customers, then it's like, I guess I'll just let the toilet paper run out then, because I don't want them to hate me. That's bad for business if the customers hate me. So there was this extended period when prices really should have risen more, but were these psychological factors, not primarily government. There were some anti-gouging laws and stuff like that, but mainly, I mean, you could even go to stores where things were running out and they were still having sales.
Yeah.
I don't think the gouging authorities are going to fine you because you didn't run a sale. That's highly unlikely. It's more of, well, we have a standard way of doing it. And for a while, this meant that many products were just unavailable. I'd say that during like 2021, on a typical deal, I would say at least 5 times a week, there's a product that I wanted that I just couldn't get.
Huh.
And
Okay.
then finally, I was keeping very close track of this because I think this was really almost never happened before, maybe once a month. And now it's happening like 5 times a week. It's a dramatic change. And then prices finally started rising. And well, yeah, once they finally rose enough, then everything that you wanted to pay for was available as long as you're willing to pay for it. Right? Which I say, look, it was very bad that the government had these first of all, lockdowns, of course, terrible monetary policy, terrible fiscal policy, right? But when prices rose, this was the market having doing the harm minimizing thing of finally getting the world back to a new normal, instead of just sticking out at this really crummy system where markets were acting as if we had price controls.
That's a great take. I mean, I haven't heard that take before on what happened. That's great. Makes sense. All right. Jacob says, if you could plan a family of all boys, all girls, or even split, what would you choose?
Yeah, so I got my first 3 kids are sons. My daughter, then I got one daughter after that. I definitely like the variety. It's a very different experience to have a daughter. Honestly, a lot of this is that I'm not nearly as macho as many people think, and I have a lot of female interests. I love karaoke, and my daughter's the only one that will do karaoke with
There
me.
you go.
I just love music, and I can do classical or opera with my older sons, but my daughter will do pop and rock, and I love that stuff too. So some of this you could say, well, there's just normal personality variation, but as you might guess, given what I said about personality, there's a lot of evidence that men and women have different personalities on average.
Yep.
I have a piece arguing that actually the official measured differences understate the true differences. And so, I do like that variety. If I were just a really macho guy who just wanted to have a bunch of buddies to do my macho stuff with, and I also have a bunch of very typically male interests, like, role-playing games. Not many women are into role-playing games, and graphic novels. Not so many women into those, or just economics and philosophy. Those are fairly male things. If all of my interests were very male, then I guess I probably would go with wanting to have all sons. With the exception of, when we had the daughter, I was also telling my now there's a bunch of things that you weren't going to get to do that now you get to do, so now you'll be happier. And there is the old saying, happy wife, happy life.
Which is probably true.
Yes. I would, ultimately, I would say that at the level of the couple, it's best to get a mix of both.
Yes.
As to what you want your mix to be otherwise, then I'd say, yeah, like if you just are thinking about how many buddies am I going to have to do the fun stuff that I like doing, then same sex is usually better for you. But yeah, like there is so much random variation that, like, on the one hand, like almost anything, almost anything can happen, like all the way down to bad outcomes, which I do not deny. I'm not a fool. Like, I don't think Charles Manson's mom was planning on having him.
No. All right, Richard says, if housing became so abundant and most homes fall in value below their mortgage, what would keep homeowners from walking away from their mortgages?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is that if this were to happen in a day, then I actually would be pretty worried about financial crisis and a bunch of other problems. But two things. First of all, so if the deregulation happened in a day, it would still take decades to actually catch up because we're so far behind. And so that means that there's plenty of time to go and actually gradually adjust. So, and then on top of it, obviously the deregulation won't happen that quickly anyway. But I'm very comfortable in saying I would push the button for instant deregulation and the consequences would be good overall. I think I would give it like 10, 15% chance of some severe financial crisis akin to the Great Depression. But I would say, actually, compared to all the harm we have in the housing market, it would be better to have another great recession, excuse me. Did I say Great Depression?
Yeah,
Great recession.
yeah, you said Great Depression, but it's probably
no, not the Great Depression, the Great Recession, the one that we lived recently.
Yeah.
So it was bad. It wasn't the end of the world.
Yep.
And to go and actually get this market working well again.
Oh, and on the other side of
it,
I mean, yeah, things would be so much better on the other side.
Yes. Yeah. So but anyway, that's the main thing I would say is that even after total deregulation, it would just take decades for the housing for the price to get back down to equilibrium because like we don't have the workers to go and build on those homes that quickly. It really is true, but the demand totally is there. By the way, there's a piece that I really liked called Revive Construction, Not the Rust Belt. So you probably know there's these national conservatives who really want to have a lot of protectionism to bring back manufacturing to go and save working class males. And and I like most of my friends just want to go make fun of them and say how terrible they are. Look, all right, I've got something way better than your idea that does everything you want, which is deregulate construction. Right? That's a way better thing for working class males to be doing than trying to strangle off international supply of manufacturers. And it's like, look, here's the thing. The main reason why we don't have that much manufacturing employment anymore is that we've gotten so good at manufacturing stuff. So people are almost satiated. Like Yaron, if someone went and said, here's 5 TVs for free, here you go. Probably you wouldn't even want, maybe you want 1 or 2, but you don't even want 5 TVs.
Nope.
But if someone said, I can go and give you a house of twice your current size for the current price, that's something where people are still sufficiently starved for living space that
you can't export those jobs. You can't build a house in China and bring it back in.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So, I mean, with really good deregulation, we might be able to do a lot more prefabrication of construction supplies. And I mean, honestly, if you're paying attention at construction sites, a lot of stuff now is prefab. There are some economists claiming that this is another huge effect. They might be right, but I'm just not convinced. And the main guy that says it seems a little crazy, but maybe he's right.
That prefab does what?
You're basically saying that if it were not for a few government regulations, that almost all homes would be pretty much totally prefab now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that sounds exaggerated, but the specific regulations he mentioned just seem implausibly small to be.
But that's the amazing thing is that we don't know what a free market will actually bring us, right? What kind of innovation in construction methodology and methods and prefab and importation of new materials. I mean, all kinds of stuff is possible.
Right. But you always want to go and see, if someone blames something on regulation, say, is there a regulation that stops that? And there's often someone who just has a pet peeve and then they say regulations on it, well, how exactly?
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's like, well, if anything, the regulation would do the opposite of what you're talking about.
Well, unless you're innovating in some significant way, which then has all kinds of safety regulation stuff, that would be a constraint. But
right. Or it's just something so new that you don't even know how you would begin to get it approved.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Frank says, how does a developer buy a big old house, knock it down, then build 3 small houses in its place? How does a developer? How do new houses come on a new street? I have no idea what he's talking about.
Hmm. I mean, I've never worked in construction. Well, I've done a little bit helping my dad, but the it's pretty simple. If you've got enough room to go and build multiple houses, so you can like the simplest thing, of course, is just to go and like put a wall down the middle of an existing house, which can be done. But even more likely, you would just want to go and knock down the old one and then just put a bunch more, which can either, depending upon the price of land, you might want to make it tall. You might want to just do a bunch of single family homes in closer proximity to each other. There are so many different possibilities, almost all of which are strictly regulated. Important to remember. So building high, strictly regulated, multifamily, strictly regulated, and also just the size, the amount of land that you have to use per house, strictly regulated.
So Mark asked, this is for you, do you or the center, I'm not sure what center, have any events or speeches you are planning in 2024, 2025?
Right. So my main job is at the Center for Study of Public Choice, and there during the normal school year, we've got seminars every week, except like first and last week of the semester. So if you're in Fairfax, Virginia, like open to the public, anyone can come and join those. On my Substack, I basically always say anytime I'm going to a city and let people know in case I happen to be in your neighborhood. Let's see, next I'm going to Prospera in Honduras to their charter city, and then I'm going to be giving a talk in Portugal. Then I'm going to be visiting professor in the Canary Islands. So that's going to be pretty cool. I'll be there for like 4 or 5 weeks. Right. And then I'm actually associated with another center, which is the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas. They have irregular events, but if you subscribe to their Twitter feed, you'll find out about everything that's happening there. So that's Austin, Texas, right on the UT campus. And there you can hang out with Greg Salmieri, Yaron's friend.
Absolutely. All right. Ori asks, well, he says, I don't know. Let's see if there's a question here. Jim Simmons, Renaissance's success in using algorithms to predict price movements seem to disprove a random walk down Wall Street, efficient market theories, etc. Thoughts?
Yeah, so actually I was the teaching assistant for Burton Malkiel, who is the author of A Random Walk Down Wall Street, and was also, I believe, with John Bogle, co-founder of Vanguard. I'm a little unclear on quite what his institutional role is. Here's what I'll say. First of all, standard efficient markets model works very well compared to the alternatives. Right. So almost all simple-minded theories about how markets work can be statistically don't work. And think about this. Most normal people really do have a theory of this is either a good year for stocks or a bad year for stocks. And how do you know if it's a good year or bad year? Good years follow good years, bad years follow bad years. That's the model. This one is like, gee, if it were that simple, how come, why aren't you rich? Why, how could people not miss this? And yes, so when you go and do statistical tests or something like that, then you'll see those are wrong, right? There's a lot of other claims that people have tested. Most of them are wrong. There is a subset that seem to work statistically, at least for a while. Probably the most famous is the January effect. This one, it just seemed like for a very long time in a whole lot of countries, the stock market gained a lot more in January than any other month. From what I understand, the January effect doesn't work anymore.
No, it's
for
gone.
a while, people were saying, well, now the January effect happens in December. And then it's just gone. Right. So this is a standard market story where if there was a pattern, then people would find out about it, they would invest on it, and then as a result, it would cease to be true. All right. Now, anytime you have any particular business trading or trading strategy that seems to be working, there really, I say you got a couple possibilities. One is there are so many different millions of trading strategies you could try that the odds that one will look like it's fantastic just because somebody got lucky. Of course, if you roll enough dice, then someone is going to seem lucky. So you really, and then it's and if you roll enough dice, someone can get lucky several times in a row. And it does not show that actually they really do have some magic technique, but rather they just got lucky. Now, another possibility is that there is a genuine pattern and it doesn't go away because you need such special skills to take advantage of it. So there is at least some evidence that seem pretty plausible to me that there are some slight correlations at the level of a month, where if you actually following daily movements at the level of a month, you might be able to get something. But the problem is there's such slight correlations and they're just a bit above chance that you would really have to go and do a lot of investing over a very long period to reliably make money doing it. And also you need to have a fairly high level of sophistication to actually do that kind of trading. So that's another story that makes sense. And then, like a final one is there are just a few magic people who just have some incredible ability. And I'll say, look, I definitely believe that in the world of business, there's totally people like that. As to whether they are, like, how many of them are in finance versus other fields, it's hard to say. Like there is you've always got to wonder, like the guy who like had the highest return on Wall Street this year, did he get lucky? I mean, another one is maybe he just did something super high risk and then like there's other people who also did super high risks who lost everything, and he got super high risks and made a bundle, but it's not something to emulate.
Yeah, I mean, Simmons, the results he got were over 30 years and about as extraordinary as one can get. Given his math background and given what they were doing ahead of the curve, it's likely that they found very small anomalies that they could take advantage of very, very quickly. And they could shift their models to discover new anomalies constantly. And partially it's people like that who make the markets efficient for the rest of us.
Yes, could well be. I mean, it does seem like from index funds that
Chicago school thing where the professor walks with the students, it says, there's $100 bill, and the professor says it can be if there was somebody who would have picked it up.
Yes.
Well, it's the Simmons of the world in a sense who pick these things up. And I think the returns it went down long term because other very sophisticated investors got into the same space.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's also some incredible math geniuses who managed to lose all their money, which, so like, I'm not saying that there aren't these people. It's like, it's not as obvious as people would think, especially when you just remember how many people on earth are trying to get rich in the financial markets.
Oh, everybody.
It's
almost nobody.
Tens of millions of people are trying to do it. So like, it wouldn't be like just by chance alone. There's like you'd expect there to be some modest number of people who even have great 30-year streaks.
Yeah.
Now, like in terms of just how much business genius there is. During COVID, I got to hang out with Steve Kuhn, who is like the greatest entrepreneur that I know. And I was in his car when he was doing business. We were driving around together. He's started a lot of different businesses. He's the founder of Major League Pickleball. He was big at Pine River Capital. He's got like lots of different businesses. And the more I talked to him, this was what was the insight that I gathered. When a normal person gives me their business idea, my reaction is a definite, that is a terrible idea. Don't put a penny of your money into it. It is ridiculous. It is awful. Don't do it.
Yep.
When Steve had an idea, I'd hear it like, I don't know, maybe. And that's the difference between genius and a normal person. It's not that all his ideas sounded great, but none of his ideas were ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then out of the ones that he decided to try, a high enough share were really successful that he was fabulously rich. But like I really did feel like I got a window into actual practicing entrepreneurship from hanging out with him during COVID, which was great pleasure. And just to see the difference between him and a normal person. Other normal people, they have an idea. Well, I'm thinking about doing this, and then a year later, I'm still thinking about it. And Steve, you'd say I'm thinking about it, then I'd fly back and hang out with him 3 weeks later. And it's like, what's happening? Oh, we're moving forward. And it was like, we're moving forward already. Like he built a theme park during COVID. He really did. It's called Dreamland. And like I was having lunch with him and he was describing this all. And I was like, and this is an idea? And he's like, no, it's done. I'll take you there tomorrow. And I told my son, so either we're going to find out that he really exaggerates or that he is way more amazing than we realized. And I got there. All right. Wow.
He's more amazing. Way amazing, huh?
Amazing stuff.
That's cool. Well, this has been great. Thanks. This has been a lot of fun, Bryan. Thank you guys for all the questions. We went over 2 hours, so I appreciate the time.
All right.
And,
a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was fun.
All right.
So, seeing you somewhere in the world, maybe in the Salem Center or in Austin sometime.
All right. Sounds good. All right. So keep in touch, Yaron. Talk to you later.
Yep. Thanks, Bryan. Bye.
Bye.